Edward II of England was murdered with a red-hot poker shoved up his rectum. At least, that's what people whispered in medieval taverns across Europe. But here's the truly shocking part. The woman who probably ordered this horrific execution was his own wife, Isabella of France, and she did it after publicly humiliating him in ways that would make a modern dictator blush. This wasn't just any royal marriage gone wrong. This was a 20-year descent into political chaos that began with Edward's obsession with male favorites and ended with him cowering in a Welsh castle while his queen led an army against him. From the moment Edward II took the throne, everyone knew something was off about this new king. While other medieval rulers surrounded themselves with experienced advisors and military commanders, Edward became completely obsessed with a young Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. And we're not talking about normal royal friendship here. This was an obsession that scandalized the entire kingdom and set the stage for decades of political chaos. Edward had actually met Gaveston years earlier, when his father had assigned the young Gascon to his household. But Edward I quickly realized this friendship was becoming problematic and banished Gaveston from England. The old king knew his son's weaknesses, and he could see that Gaveston was becoming way too influential. But the second Edward I died, literally one of the first things Edward II did as king was recall his favorite from exile. Not appoint military commanders for ongoing wars, not address pressing financial issues, not even properly plan his own coronation. No, his top priority was getting Gaveston back. The speed and obviousness of this decision sent shockwaves through the English court. Medieval kingship was all about maintaining dignity, showing strength, and making decisions that benefited the realm. Edward II did the exact opposite. He showered Gaveston with titles, lands, and wealth that should have gone to established noble families. He made him Earl of Cornwall, gave him royal jewels, and worst of all, he clearly valued Gaveston's opinions above those of his most important nobles. But here's where it gets really crazy. Gaveston wasn't just some quiet court favorite who stayed in the background. This guy had serious attitude. He openly mocked the great earls of England, giving them insulting nicknames and treating them like they were beneath him. Imagine being one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, coming from families that had served English kings for generations, and having some upstart foreigner dismiss you while the king laughs along. The Earl of Lancaster became the actor because of his theatrical mannerisms. The Earl of Pembroke was called Joseph the Jew. These weren't playful jokes between friends. These were calculated insults designed to humiliate men who controlled vast armies and territories. The English nobles had tolerated a lot from their kings over the centuries, but this was beyond anything they'd experienced. They weren't just dealing with a weak king, they were dealing with a king who seemed actively committed to insulting them while elevating someone they saw as completely unworthy. The tension built month after month, with Gaveston's arrogance growing alongside Edward's obvious favoritism, until something had to give. In 1308, the pressure became so intense that the nobles forced Edward to exile Gaveston again. But Edward couldn't help himself. Within a year, he'd found a way to bring his favorite back. This pattern of exile and return happened multiple times, each cycle making the nobles angrier and more determined to find a permanent solution. They were watching their king repeatedly choose personal obsession over political stability, and they knew it was destroying the kingdom's reputation across Europe. The situation reached a breaking point in 1312 when a group of nobles, led by Edward's own cousin Thomas of Lancaster, decided they'd had enough. They captured Gaveston and executed him, not in some secret assassination, but as a deliberate political statement. They wanted everyone to understand that no royal favorite, no matter how beloved by the king, could humiliate the nobility without consequences. Edward's reaction to Gaveston's death revealed just how completely this relationship had consumed him. He was devastated, furious, and completely focused on revenge rather than trying to heal the massive political wounds that had opened up in his kingdom. While Edward II was obsessing over court favorites and personal grudges, the situation in Scotland was spinning completely out of control. His father, Edward I, had spent years trying to conquer Scotland and had actually been pretty successful at it. But that success depended on constant military pressure and political skill, two things Edward II completely lacked. And the Scots had produced a leader who was about to become one of the most famous warriors in history, Robert the Bruce. Robert the Bruce was everything Edward II wasn't: a brilliant military strategist, a charismatic leader, and someone who understood exactly how to exploit his enemies' weaknesses. Bruce had been fighting for Scottish independence for years, but when Edward II became king, he immediately saw an opportunity. This new English king was clearly more interested in personal drama than military campaigns, and Bruce was ready to take full advantage of that distraction. The disaster really began building after Gaveston's execution in 1312. Edward was so consumed with rage and grief that he barely paid attention to what was happening north of the border. Meanwhile, Bruce was systematically capturing English strongholds throughout Scotland, using guerrilla tactics and siege warfare to devastating effect. Castle after castle fell to the Scots, but Edward was too busy plotting revenge against his own nobles to mount any serious response. By 1314, the situation had become absolutely critical. The Scots had besieged Stirling Castle, one of the last major English strongholds in Scotland, and the castle's commander had agreed to surrender if no relief force arrived by midsummer. This meant Edward finally had to act. He couldn't ignore such a direct challenge to English authority. But here's the thing, Edward II had never actually commanded a major military campaign before. His father had been one of the most successful military leaders in Europe, but Edward had always been more interested in tournaments and court life than real warfare. The English army that marched north in 1314 was massive, probably around 20,000 men, including heavily armored knights and experienced infantry. On paper, they completely outclassed Bruce's force of maybe 6,000 Scots. Edward was so confident that he brought along plenty of supplies for a victory celebration and even had plans for dividing up captured Scottish lands among his supporters. The English nobility, despite their hatred for the king, showed up in force because this was about national pride and their own holdings in Scotland. But Robert the Bruce had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. He chose the battlefield carefully, near a little town called Bannockburn, where the terrain would neutralize the English advantage in heavy cavalry. He dug hidden pits filled with spikes, positioned his troops to force the English into narrow approaches, and most importantly, he had absolute confidence in his men while Edward's army was full of nobles who barely trusted their king. The Battle of Bannockburn was a complete catastrophe for the English. Edward's tactical decisions were terrible from the start. He allowed his forces to get bogged down in marshy ground where their cavalry couldn't maneuver. He failed to coordinate between different parts of his army, and when things started going wrong, he completely lost his nerve. The disciplined Scottish infantry formations tore through the confused English ranks, and what should have been an easy English victory turned into one of the most humiliating defeats in English military history. But the worst part wasn't just losing the battle, it was how Edward II behaved during the defeat. While his men were dying around him, Edward fled the field so quickly that he abandoned not just his army but also his personal seal, his shield, and even his helmet. Medieval kings were expected to fight alongside their men and share their fate, but Edward was so terrified that he ran faster than anyone else. The image of the English king fleeing in panic while Scottish peasants slaughtered English knights became legendary across Europe. The aftermath of Bannockburn was devastating for Edward's reputation. Scotland was essentially lost. Bruce was now undisputed King of Scots and would spend the next decade raiding northern England almost at will. But even worse for Edward personally, every noble in England now knew beyond any doubt that their king was a coward. Medieval kingship depended on military leadership and personal courage, and Edward had publicly failed at both. The defeat didn't just lose territory, it destroyed whatever credibility Edward had left with his own people. After the disaster at Bannockburn, Edward II's marriage became the next front in his personal war of self-destruction. His wife, Isabella of France, had initially seemed like the perfect political alliance. She was beautiful, intelligent, and came from the most powerful royal family in Europe. But as Edward's reign continued to spiral into chaos, Isabella transformed from a dutiful wife into one of the most dangerous political players of the medieval period. Isabella had actually been pretty patient with Edward's obvious lack of interest in their marriage. Medieval royal marriages were political arrangements, and she understood that romance wasn't necessarily part of the deal. But what she couldn't tolerate was being publicly humiliated while Edward lavished attention and resources on his new favorites, particularly Hugh Despenser the Younger, who had replaced Gaveston as the king's obsession after 1312. Hugh Despenser was, if anything, worse than Gaveston had been. Where Gaveston had at least been charming and witty, Despenser was ruthlessly ambitious and completely greedy. He used his influence with the king to seize lands, manipulate legal cases, and enrich himself at the expense of other nobles. But most insulting to Isabella, Despenser seemed to actively work to isolate her from Edward, treating the queen like she was a threat to his position rather than the king's wife and the mother of the future king. The breaking point came in 1325 when Edward sent Isabella to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, about ongoing territorial disputes. This should have been a routine diplomatic mission, but Isabella saw it as an opportunity to escape England and start building her own power base. Once she was in France, surrounded by her family and their resources, she began planning something unprecedented: the overthrow of her own husband. Isabella's transformation during this period was absolutely remarkable. The woman who had spent nearly 20 years as Edward's neglected wife suddenly revealed herself to be a brilliant political strategist. She began building alliances with English exiles who had fled Edward's reign, most importantly Roger Mortimer, a powerful lord who had escaped from the Tower of London and made his way to the French court. Mortimer was perfect for Isabella's purposes. He was one of England's most experienced military commanders. He had his own personal grudges against Edward and the Despensers, and he brought credibility to any rebellion against the king. But their alliance quickly became more than just political. Isabella and Mortimer began a passionate affair that scandalized courts across Europe. Here was the Queen of England, still married to Edward II, openly living with another man while planning to invade her husband's kingdom. The invasion Isabella launched in 1326 was a masterpiece of political timing and propaganda. She didn't come as a foreign conqueror but as a wronged wife seeking to rescue England from the Despensers' corruption. She brought with her the teenage Prince Edward, the king's own son and heir, which gave her cause immediate legitimacy. Her small invasion force grew rapidly as English nobles flocked to her banner, not necessarily because they loved Isabella, but because they saw a chance to finally get rid of Edward II and his hated favorites. Edward's response to his wife's invasion was characteristic. He panicked completely. Instead of trying to rally his supporters or negotiate some kind of settlement, he fled west toward Wales with Hugh Despenser, apparently hoping to escape to Ireland. The sight of the king running away from his own wife was so pathetic that even his remaining supporters began abandoning him. Town after town declared for Isabella, and within months, Edward's 20-year reign had essentially collapsed. The speed of Edward's fall was breathtaking. In less than 4 months, Isabella had gone from exiled queen to the effective ruler of England. She captured the Despensers and had them brutally executed. Hugh Despenser the Younger was hanged, drawn, and quartered in front of cheering crowds who blamed him for years of corruption and misrule. But Isabella's real masterstroke was forcing Edward II to abdicate in favor of their teenage son, who became Edward III with Isabella and Mortimer as regents. This was unprecedented in English history. Queens weren't supposed to lead military campaigns against their husbands, and they certainly weren't supposed to win. But Isabella had read the political situation perfectly. She understood that Edward II had become so hated that almost anyone would be preferable as a ruler, even a foreign-born queen with a questionable personal life. The deposition of Edward II in 1327 should have been the end of the story, but Isabella and Mortimer faced a problem that would haunt them for months. What do you do with a deposed king who's still alive? Edward II had abdicated under pressure, but he remained a potential focus for any rebellion against the new regime. Medieval politics were brutal, and everyone understood that former kings rarely lived long after losing their thrones. Edward was initially held at various castles throughout England, moved frequently to prevent any rescue attempts. But his mere existence was a constant threat to Isabella and Mortimer's power. As long as Edward II lived, there would always be the possibility that someone might try to restore him, especially if the Regency government made unpopular decisions. The solution to this problem would become one of the most notorious murders in medieval history. In April 1327, Edward was moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, under the custody of Thomas Berkeley and John Maltravers. These weren't random choices. Both men had personal reasons to hate Edward II and could be trusted to handle a delicate situation. But even at Berkeley, Edward remained dangerous. There were rumors of rescue plots, and some sources suggest that Edward actually did escape briefly before being recaptured. The pressure on Isabella and Mortimer was intensifying. Their Regency government was already facing criticism for being too close to France, and whispers were starting about Isabella's relationship with Mortimer. They needed Edward II gone permanently, but they couldn't be seen as directly ordering his murder. The solution they chose was both clever and horrific. They would have Edward killed in a way that left no obvious signs of violence, allowing them to claim he had died naturally. On the night of September 21, 1327, Edward II died at Berkeley Castle under circumstances that immediately sparked rumors and legends. The official story was that the former king had succumbed to illness, but nobody believed that for a second. The most persistent rumor, which appeared almost immediately and has never been completely disproven, was that Edward was murdered by having a red-hot iron rod inserted into his body through the rectum, a method that would kill him horribly while leaving no external marks. This particular method of murder, if it actually happened, was probably chosen for its symbolic meaning. Medieval people were obsessed with the idea that punishments should fit crimes, and Edward's supposed homosexual relationships with Gaveston and Despenser had been a constant source of scandal throughout his reign. The hot iron would have been seen as a grotesque parody of sexual intercourse, a final humiliation for a king whose personal life had caused so much political damage. Whether or not the gruesome details are true, Edward II was definitely murdered on Isabella's orders. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too suspicious, and the political benefits too obvious for his death to have been natural. Isabella had crossed a line that even by medieval standards was shocking. She had orchestrated the murder of her own husband, the anointed King of England. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death seemed to solve Isabella and Mortimer's problems. There were no major rebellions, no foreign invasions seeking to avenge the dead king, and the transition to Edward III's reign appeared to go smoothly. But the murder would eventually destroy both Isabella and Mortimer, because they had forgotten one crucial factor: Edward III was growing up, and he was nothing like his father. Edward II's death in 1327 marked the end of one of the most catastrophic reigns in English history, but the consequences of his failures continued to shape England for generations. His 20-year rule had been such a complete disaster that it fundamentally changed how English people thought about kingship, nobility, and the relationship between personal behavior and political power. The immediate aftermath of Edward's murder revealed just how thoroughly he had poisoned English politics. Isabella and Mortimer, who had seemed so triumphant in 1326, quickly discovered that ruling England was much harder than conquering it. Their regency faced all the same problems that had plagued Edward II: financial difficulties, ongoing conflicts with Scotland, and growing resentment from nobles who felt excluded from power. But now they had the additional burden of being regicides, people who had killed an anointed king. Edward III, who was only 14 when his father died, spent his early teenage years watching Isabella and Mortimer make many of the same mistakes that had destroyed Edward II. Mortimer in particular began acting like a king himself, taking titles and lands that should have belonged to the crown, while his relationship with Isabella became an open scandal. The young king was learning valuable lessons about power, but not the ones his mother and her lover intended. In 1330, when Edward III was just 17, he launched his own coup against Isabella and Mortimer. It was swift, decisive, and showed that the new king had inherited none of his father's weaknesses. Edward III had Mortimer executed and sent Isabella into comfortable but permanent retirement, taking personal control of the kingdom with a confidence and ruthlessness that his father had never possessed. But the damage Edward II had done to the institution of English kingship was lasting. His reign had established dangerous precedents. It showed that English nobles were willing to rebel against and even kill their king if he became too unpopular, and it demonstrated that queens and regents could successfully challenge royal authority. These precedents would return to haunt later English kings, most notably Richard II and Charles I, both of whom were deposed and killed by their own subjects. Edward II's personal failures also had broader consequences for medieval attitudes towards sexuality and royal behavior. His relationships with male favorites became legendary across Europe, not just because of the political chaos they caused, but because they challenged traditional ideas about masculine kingship. Later chroniclers would use Edward II as an example of how personal weakness and sexual deviance could destroy even the most powerful ruler. Perhaps most tragically, Edward II's reign represented a complete waste of England's potential during a crucial period in European history. His father, Edward I, had left him a kingdom that was militarily powerful, financially stable, and respected across Europe. By 1327, England had lost Scotland, exhausted its treasury, and become a byword for political chaos. It would take his son Edward III decades to restore English prestige, and some of the damage, particularly the loss of Scotland, would never be fully repaired. The story of Edward II serves as one of history's clearest examples of how personal failings can destroy political institutions. He wasn't evil in the way some medieval kings were. He didn't massacre his subjects or launch unprovoked wars. But his inability to understand the responsibilities of kingship, his obsession with inappropriate favorites, and his complete lack of political judgment made him just as dangerous to his kingdom as any tyrant. In the end, Edward II's greatest tragedy wasn't his horrible death, but his spectacular waste of the opportunities and responsibilities that came with being King of England.